Bonjour, and welcome to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle, from tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride. Let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/129, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or call the voicemail hotline 202-930-1109 and check Pedalshift out on all the socials as well. Bonjour, everyone. You can probably tell I am recording from Paris, France. This is Tim Mooney, and welcome to a special edition of the Pedalshift Project. This is an exciting edition for me. I cannot remember if I recorded a show here in prior incarnations of the show, but I am this time, and I thought I would take advantage of the fact that I'm here doing a little bit of work for a writing retreat that my girlfriend runs every year, every other year. We're going to Italy next year, so I think we may be doing Paris as an every other year kind of thing from now on. But one of the great elements of being in Paris allows me to really kind of soak up the bicycling culture here in France and Paris, of course, in particular. So I thought that I would take advantage of that and talk about bicycle touring in France for the entire episode. I will state at the outset, and I think I may have said this on a prior edition as well, I have not yet actually done a bike tour here in France, but I, as you probably will have figured out, have done a ton of research on it because I'm really, really interested in doing it. So much of this pod is about a brain dump of the things that I've discovered and eventually test out. And I often talk about it before I do things anyways. That's the whole thing with the lab. That's, lots of things. So just to be upfront, I actually have not put panniers on a bike and done any camping, bike camping in France. I have, however, done a lot of traveling, and I've hit a lot of campsites on a trip in the south of France that I did several years ago. So I definitely have some insight on the larger culture and some tips from that experience. The other very cool thing is a lot of you actually wrote in and provided your information and your experience from bicycle touring here in France. So we've got a ton of good information to share if you're at all interested. Even if it's something you haven't really considered before, I think that it's just interesting insight to see what the bicycle touring culture is in France, and it might just be of interest to you from a cultural perspective. So in any event, I thought I would talk a little bit about sort of my, I guess we'd say my biggest barrier right now. And that is not that I'm not here, not that I don't tend to have the time to do some bicycle touring. It's just that, frankly, I don't speak French. I mean, I can fake it a little bit. I've got sort of the usual sort of guidebook working conversational kinds of things when it comes to French, but I didn't take it in high school. I thought it would be the least relevant language for me to take in my life, and it turns out when all is said and done, it probably would have been the most relevant. Maybe Spanish would have been a little bit ahead of that, but French would have been helpful if I had actually taken it. I'm working on those survival phrases, and I always leave every trip I come out here. I think it's probably my fourth or fifth time in France. I always leave a little bit more comfortable with interactions and the language. Paris is just, for those of you who've never been to France before, it's really good training wheels as an English speaker because so many people here in the city of Paris speak English. I, as just sort of a working rule, always try French first. And when people hear my awful accent that do speak English, they tend to pivot right into English off of that. I don't know if that is, well, let's just put it this way. This is sort of my nod to saying, hey, I'm going to try within your culture. And I think I would do this in any country where English is not the predominant language. Try in the local native tongue. And if the folks there actually speak English better than I speak their language, they'll generally tend to pivot to that. And I don't know. I think I would appreciate that if I was in their shoes. And anyways, that's just sort of my frame of mind. Bottom line, I'm just not very good at French, and I need to get better if I intend to do a bicycle tour. But as I've been learning, I don't think it's necessary. I think that you can certainly survive in areas of France where you may be running into somebody who doesn't speak English or doesn't speak your language, your primary language. For those of my European listeners who speak multiple languages, I am incredibly jealous of you. I think that that's such a great tool to have. And unfortunately, despite the fact that I was exposed to a variety of different languages in my educational settings, none of them ever really stuck. And as you listen to the show, you know that I barely speak English in the first place. So I would love to hear more from you. And of course, I've got some folks I'll be sharing their experiences. But for those of you who have done tours in France, I'll do a little bit of a follow-up episode. Would love to supplement what I'm going to be talking about here as well. So I kind of divvied this all up. We'll get to the experiences of other folks as well, which will supplement what I'm going to do, but I'm going to share my sort of background and my knowledge first, and then I'll kind of do the add-ons of the other folks here because there's some really good stuff. The first thing I wanted to talk about was camping. The logistics of getting your bike here and stuff like that, I will talk a little bit about, but because it's so, I don't want to say random. It's so different for everybody coming from different places around the world. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that, although that's usually, if you're traveling to a different country, your very first kind of consideration. So we'll get to that in a little bit, but let's kind of fast forward. Let's get you on the bike and out there, and let's talk about the camping, because I think that that's where France really excels. France has an enormous, great, huge camping culture. And for whatever reason, that just kind of surprised me. I don't know why I came into things when I first was coming to France, but I was really genuinely surprised that there was kind of that good outdoor camping culture. If you Google around and go on the internet, and we all know that all things on the internet are true, right? About 8 million people camp in France's 10,000 registered campsites per year. Now, that's mostly going to be car camping, but the setup is wide and plentiful for bike camping as well, which is really great. In the summer, and when we talk summer, we're talking kind of middle, end of July and into August. All of these campsites are going to be, all caps, packed. August is the big month for vacations for France. And I think that's probably true for a lot of countries, but it's particularly true in France. If you come to Paris, for instance, in August, a lot of people will say, A, it's going to be hot. B, a lot of places, a lot of boulangeries, the bakeries, patisseries, things like that, they're going to actually be shut for a chunk of August. So you may find fewer options for you available in the city of Paris, but throughout the rest of the entire country as well, because it's such a vacation-y month. And where are many of them going? They're going to a lot of these campsites. So if you're going to be touring in the summer, be ready for some crowds. Kind of the same as everybody else, but I think it's particularly acute in France. Now, if you want to have a little bit less of crowding and maybe a little less heat, then consider looking outside of July and August. I think the spring in France in particular is pretty great. Now, of course, if you're going to be at elevation in mountains, you may be running into some issues there. It might be a lot colder. There might even be some snow. Just depends on what part of the country that you go to, of course. Winter, a lot of the campsites, the plentiful campsites throughout the country, are actually fully closed. So you'll want to find some good timing in all of that. If you're a winter biker anyways, you'll probably do just fine. It's just that your options are going to be more limited than, say, the spring and the fall. I think that my favorite experience with campsites were with municipal campsites that are run by the various villages throughout the entire country. They tend to be really great values. I believe that they're referred to as AIRES, AIRES. That's my recollection. I did not look that up to confirm it. Sometimes they're just a couple of euro per night, which is a really incredible value. Some of the private ones, and the ones I'm particularly thinking of, are along the Med. They're resorts. They're full-fledged resorts. They've got pools, they've got beaches, and they'll cost a lot more. My recollection is that with the RV, on the RV trip, it was upwards of maybe 40 or even 50 euro a night, which of course gets into kind of hostel and hotel range. Now, not hostels and hotels around there, because that's sort of the prime area, and that was the summer and whatnot. Now, if you're not with an RV and you're with a tent and you're bicycling, perhaps it would be a little bit cheaper, but that's going to vary really a lot. The more amenities, the more resorty the camping spots are, the more expensive they're going to be. Kind of file under duh, right? They're really great, though. I remember one particular campsite that we stayed in a few years ago, and it was just magical. We were there. There were fireworks on the beach at night. We were not far from Antibes, if I recall correctly. So, I mean, it was really, if you wanted to have kind of that sort of shishi experience of the French Riviera, well, you could do that. But it was really kind of fun. And the other thing that I really liked about was just walking around the campsite and seeing all of the different EU license tags on all the various campers and just seeing where everybody was coming from. You know, it was all over the map, literally. And I thought that was kind of cool too. So you'd have an interesting opportunity to interact with people from not just France, but all throughout of Europe. And I think that is kind of an extra bonus there, especially if you're on the more social side of things. If you're a little bit more of an introvert, especially during the summer, like I said, things are going to be very crowded, and, you know, retreating into your tent may be the way to go if you just don't want to kind of handle all of that. Maps in France are excellent indicators of where there are campsites. And I'm just talking like your regular road map. There's kind of the international icon, that little kind of teepee tent kind of a thing, that shows where there are campsites for, especially for the municipal ones. Make sure that you have a good paper map of the area that you're in as sort of a supplement for any kind of app that you're using, because it can be really helpful of telling you what's in the area, and they're free and easy to get usually pretty quickly. One thing for you wild campers, I know a lot of folks would prefer not to spend any money for their accommodations. Wild camping, just so you know, is technically illegal in France, but that's true in so many other countries where people do it all the time. As always, if you are going to do it, practice good technique. Don't be a jerk. Pack in, pack out, stay hidden, arrive late, leave early, respect the property. Hopefully these are all things that you're practicing anywhere you do wild camping. You should be fine, is sort of the idea that I get from a variety of the bike tours that I've been doing the research on. There's a couple of very good websites out there that I'll talk about in a few minutes as well. So camping is really kind of the best part of all of this. It's as social as you want it to be. It can be as high end as you want it to be. And wild camping, while illegal, is still a possibility so long as you're following good practices. So camping, France, awesome. Let's talk about food, because it's just awesome here. It's France, a bakery in every town, fresh food. There is, I don't know why, I don't know what it is, but the food does taste better here. I don't know if it's their farming practices. I don't know what it is, but it could be all in my head, but I feel like the food is just straight up better here. If you cook, chances are you can get fresh ingredients every day, unless you're in a really remote spot or unless it's Sunday. And we'll talk about that in a second. If you don't cook, chances are you'll find cafes, groceries, markets, just about anything that you could possibly want in almost every single town. There are some towns that are so small they don't even have a cafe or anything like that. Often gas stations, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, are around in some of those very small towns, but they don't always have food, unlike in some other countries around Europe and, of course, in North America as well. So you'll want to keep an eye out on that. The other thing that you want to keep an eye out, especially if you're not a cooker, is watching out for Sundays. A lot of France towns just really shut down. It's a very kind of Sunday shutdown kind of country. If you are in a place where you don't know for sure that something is open, and of course, if you've got your phone and you've got a data plan and you can kind of look up whether things are going to be open on Sundays, you'll be able to tell. But if you don't know, assume a lot of stuff, if not everything, and wherever you're going to be going through is going to be shut down. Bakeries, Bonjour, they are often open in the mornings only, because I dare you to try to keep a French person away from fresh bread on any given day. So often they'll be open on early morning on a Sunday. But that's about it. Many towns will have everything else shut down. So I would recommend that you grab a little extra food on a Saturday, unless you know for sure that the destination the next day has something open. It's not a complete rule. There are plenty of cafes that do stay open on Sundays. It just is sort of hit and miss, and you want to be careful about all of that. So eating's pretty good. One thing that I want to say for veg and vegan types, any other trip that I've ever been here, I would have said you're going to have a rougher time. In the 6 months since I was last here, now my girlfriend is a vegan. We were a little concerned about her finding good food here. She's just recently kind of transitioned from strict vegetarian to full vegan. And on this trip, we have been amazed at the change here in Paris alone. There are so many places that are, whereas before you couldn't find a vegetarian option at all, much less a vegan option, now we're finding a lot more vegan options. So it seems that the wave of veganness has even managed to get into France as well, which is kind of more of a meat-eating country generally, just in my experience. But there are obviously plenty of good options. They have great produce and stuff like that. So you can do just fine. I don't think I would expect vegan options to be as ubiquitous in other towns, although you can certainly make that happen. Cafes, restaurants, things like that. In my experience, it's not as easy to get exceptions made to a dish. That has been more miss than hit for us. That said, we've done just fine for her on this trip, and that's worked out really well. So if you do have special dietary needs, or if you choose to eat in a particular way, you're keto, you're paleo, you're vegan, whatever, you will probably do just fine, but you'll just want to make sure that you're mindful of things. And I do have to say the veg and vegan thing has definitely improved over the last 6 months even. We were last here around the holidays, and kind of amazing. We were genuinely surprised at how easy it's been for her on this trip. Let's talk about bicycle routes, and I think that this can be almost sort of like you almost have too many choices. The paradox of choices, they call it. France has excellent routes, and they follow the larger Eurovelo routes that enter and leave the country. They go all through. They crisscross the country. If you're doing a bigger tour, I've got links in the show notes to a good resource and the official tourism site, both of which have some amazing options that can connect all of the various regions and cities on these Eurovelo routes. And if you are planning on doing a larger tour outside of France, they all connect you further east and, of course, even further west. I mean, you can do some connections into Spain. You can go up into the UK. Spoiler alert, you'll have to cross the channel, but that's not that hard. So check those out as well if you want to do something outside of or include France in your route. I use an app called Maps.me. And I use it for bicycle touring, but I found it to be very excellent for walking around different towns as well. And for bicycle routing, you download all of the mapping based on little plats, different regions of wherever you're at, whatever country you're in, whatever state, province, whatever. And you can get it when you're offline, which can be really, really helpful if you are on a limited data plan or no data. You're not rocking any data plans at all. And it even lets you search within that downloaded piece. So let's say you get some Wi-Fi, you download the area that you're at. You can even search for addresses or major places offline. I find that to be super helpful if you have limited or no access to data when you're out and about. And that's maps.me. And you can check that out. I know for sure it's on iOS. For you Android folks, I believe it's also available as well. If not, there are a variety of different offline maps that are good in France and in Europe and elsewhere. That one works worldwide, and I've had some good luck with it myself, so I would recommend that. Of course, I also talked about, don't forget, a good paper map here in France, just to at least have that additional information about secondary roads and, more importantly, access to campsites, because that gives more good information about that as well. Getting to France and getting around, I kind of previewed that just a touch at the top here. Many of you will be flying in. Many of you will be taking ferries or trains. I won't talk too much about the airline situation. I've talked about flying your bike on other episodes of the show, so you can kind of refer to that. So much depends on the carrier. I would say that I'll start off by talking about airlines first. It is possible to ride from Charles de Gaulle Airport, which is the main international airport in Paris, to the center of the city. It's only about 20 miles, so it's relatively close as the crow flies. I've got a link in the show notes to a good tested route that, and I did a little kind of Google Earth, Google Street View kind of fly over of this. It does work really well. So if you're intent on riding your bike immediately, you can do that. I did not notice any specific areas within de Gaulle that had any kind of tool stations or anything like that. Some airports are really great for that. I did not notice that here in Paris. They may exist. I just don't know about it. There's also trains and even Uber to get you from de Gaulle into the center city of Paris. We just did the RER-B, the B line, RER. Don't ask me what that stands for. It's RER. That is sort of a commuter train. Bikes are allowed. I think there are some potential restrictions. I'll have to double check on that, but it is quick. It is cheap and it is very, very easy. It's literally connected to all terminals 1, 2, and 3. I think terminals 1 and 3 are combined though. But in any event, wherever you're flying from, whatever terminal you're coming to, it's relatively easy to get to that train and come on in. Although if you are intent on riding, like I said, link in the show notes, it's there as well. In the larger scale of things, France has excellent train and ferry systems, and they tend to be very bike friendly. But as always, make sure that you check in advance for your particular route and if there's any restrictions on time. As with any place, there are local restrictions. So just make sure that you're on top of all of that. And you can always just Google that ahead of time. A tool for you that might be very helpful is Google Translate. We're just using the Google Chrome browser because it will automatically translate sites that don't have, I'm assuming everybody is a primary English speaker, or at least, that may not be true actually. You're all at least speaking English listening to this show, often struggling as I barely blurt out my native tongue. However, if you do not speak French, Google Chrome is an excellent translator into whatever your primary language is, if that's helpful for you. If you speak French, I tip my hat to you. Many people fly in and out of Paris as a start. The good news, it's a great bicycling city. It's got multiple routes that lead in and out of town. It's got a ton of bike lanes. I will say, if you're used to North American bike lanes, I tend to find them to be a little bit narrower. And on really busy roads, there are separated bike lanes, but very often you'll be going through some very busy circles, or at least confluences of major roads. And those can be a little bit, little off-putting. As with anything, hop off your bike, go in the walking lanes, the crosswalks, and then just continue on if that's something that is not feeling very good, if you don't have a lot of city riding experience. I would say for the most part, it's been pretty easy, and I kind of enjoy it. It's like New York to me because it's that busy. And although it can be a little tooth rattling at times, it's kind of fun. So getting in and getting around. The nice thing is that once you're on some of these routes, they're often very separated bike lanes, and you're off and you can get out of these cities and get into these other towns really quickly and easily. But Paris tends to be a starting and ending place for so many people. So I thought I would talk about that. I thought I would also mention what catches my eye when it comes to cycle touring in France. I love Paris, but I really enjoyed going to the south of France because it's just really beautiful. It has some interesting kind of combinations of Italian influence a little bit as well, which I found kind of interesting and fun. The downside is it's, as I mentioned before, super busy during high season. And for me personally, I don't think I would want to bike there then. As I've said time after time, I don't like sun exposure and heat, and that is the south of France in the summer. Let's just put it that way. I do have a cousin who lives and works in Brussels in Belgium, one country over, and I'm kind of intrigued with a tour loop that begins and ends in Paris, and Eurovelo routes 3 and 5 take you to Brussels. Thinking of doing a visit there and then return either the same way or take the loop through Lille, hooking up with Eurovelo Route 4. And then there's actually a London-Paris route that would take me back to Paris. So that seems like an interesting option for me, maybe next year or at some other point when I've got some time to be able to do that. Be able to see a little bit of France, be able to go to Brussels, combine a visit with family. That would be kind of fun. So that's kind of the one that's been most interesting to me. The other thing that I've found very interesting is you may have heard that this fine country has wine. The Eurovelo 3 goes from Paris to Bordeaux, which I think would be a pretty good one as well. So those are two types of routes that have caught my eye, and I'm definitely considering in the future as well. I want to pivot now to 2 listener tips and recommendations because they were just really excellent supplements to my knowledge, and I learned a lot. So I'm just going to sort of share them as a brain dump for everybody who's listening as well. The first one is Kieran from Cork, Ireland, and a little bit of backstory on me, family history on my Irish side. Allegedly, we are from Cork as well, so we had a nice little conversation offline on that. So Kieran writes, he did a tour. He doesn't have a ton of touring experience, but he did a tour in France. So it was super helpful to give the brain dump of information here for us. He concurs that France is a great cycling nation. They had a really good time. And he said they were met with patience and good nature, even though their French was minimal, which I think is really nice to hear. Because it's off-putting for me to walk into a place and you want to be able to communicate. You want to do it in a way that is respectful and not just assume, hey, everybody here speaks English, right? And so it's nice to hear that, even though if you give it a shot, if your French is kind of sucky like mine is, there's people who've had good experiences with that. France is not inexpensive. Double negative. It is expensive. Campsites, Kieran said, were clean. They were a good value, and they were very welcoming to two sweaty Irish lads, which I loved. They mainly traveled on the B roads through rural countryside, plenty of hills, but nothing too bad. And they felt that their fitness grew each day. Again, not a ton of bicycle touring experience there. The B roads are kind of your secondary country roads that you'll find in so many countries around there. You want to avoid ones that are bigger than that, obviously. Kieran said that they used the train system to make their way back to the ferry terminals, and they had no issues loading their bikes on board, either the trains or the ferries, which is really good to hear. And more confirmation that it's a very bicycle-friendly modes of transit. Last but not least, Kieran says that he doesn't have a lot of touring experience in France, but it left a long-lasting positive effect on him, and it gave him a hunger for more. So I think that that's excellent. And Kieran, thank you so much for sharing your experience touring in France. Adrian from the UK chimed in, and he did a 17-day tour through France, going from the UK and ending up in Spain. And I'm going to give a link to his blog. It's journeyswiththetank.wordpress.com. So you can check out some more specifics on his experience with that 17-day tour. It looks really, really cool. So Adrian also mentioned that he says, if you love great scenery and food, and of course good wine, you'll love cycle touring in France. He said that drivers tend to be very tolerant of cyclists and give plenty of room, which I think for those of you who are maybe a little less comfortable on roads and sharing with cars, that's some good news. That's also my experience as well. When I was in the south of France, I didn't do any bicycle touring, but I did some bicycling, and I found it to be pretty good. I do have a funny story, though. I was bicycling, and I think I told the story. I wrote this into an early episode of the Sprocket podcast, like early, and I think my email was Sacre Bleu, Fred's in France, meaning I got caught in a bike race. And it was a little off-putting as, the car goes by and trying to communicate to me, hey, get off the road, idiot. There's a bike race behind you. But I didn't know. I'm dumb American, just like, my head's on a swivel looking around. Wow, this is really pretty. Look at the mountains. And then all of a sudden, vroom, vroom, vroom. So they were very friendly to me, despite the fact that I was screwing up their race. So eventually I figured it out and got the hell off the side of the road after nearly killing all these guys coming down the mountain. Anyways, despite its love, by the way, I hope enough of my story, back to Adrian. Despite its love of good food, he writes, parts of France can be a bit of a wasteland when it comes to finding somewhere to eat. This is something I talked about a little bit earlier. Decent sized towns are fine, but villages may have no shops. The gas stations or petrol stations, depending on where you're from, outside of the big towns are often just that. In other words, they only sell fuel for vehicles. In the UK, in the US, in Canada, and lots of other different countries, you can normally buy food and snacks at almost all of these types of stations. So word to the wise, don't depend on the fact that there's going to be a gas station or petrol station in any given town as a place to get food, because it may only sell fuel for vehicles. So mindfulness on that, word to the wise. Shops and cafes, he writes, also can keep odd hours, which is similar to what I mentioned as well. They're often closed for long lunches or half days, depending on the day of the week. Sundays, as I mentioned, can often be a huge issue because many things are closed. Normally, supermarkets or bakeries will be open Sunday morning. Again, this is my experience as well, as everyone tends to buy fresh bread every day. Again, I dare you to try to keep a French person away from fresh bread on any day of the week. It's worth having at least something in your panniers, he writes, just in case. And I totally agree with that. Whether you cook or you don't, have a spare meal or a spare food, because there could be a time that you're kind of in a pinch and it's like, there's no place to buy food. It's good to have something so that you're not starving or having nothing to deal with biker hunger during that time. He writes as well, and when I say he, Adrian writes, there's a French European chain called Decathlon, and that's decathlon.fr. They sell sports and camping and cycling things. They're a really good value if you need anything that's bike related or camping related. They also sell gas cylinders if you're rocking a stove. They tend to be on the outskirts of big towns, so be mindful of that. That's the French European chain Decathlon. So I think that that's a good tip for you as well. His camping tips, Google Maps is his number one. I agree with that. Another resource which I think is excellent. It's a camping app. Although there's a link in the show notes. It's Archie's Campings with an s.eu. The Archie's Camping app. He recommends the app itself over just the website. He says it's constantly updated and shows most campsites. That's a really good recommendation. It looks very good. Campsites in France, he agrees, are fairly cheap. The facilities tend to be good. But one thing to mention, and I did not know this of other campsites. It was not my experience, but I'm glad I'm hearing this. Bring some toilet paper with you, because many of them, especially the municipal ones, don't have toilet paper. So bring a roll along. Good to know. He also agrees that the municipal sites are a very good value. Some of them even have laundry and drying facilities and even swimming pools, which was my experience as well. His map app recommendation, in addition to Archie's, is the IGN map app. And we've got a link in the show notes for that. There's a free version and a paid version. I did not check to see if this is iOS and Android, so you'll have to check that out. Again, link in the show notes. The free version only works when you have data and Wi-Fi, and it covers all of France, so you can zoom into quite a detailed layer, really, really zoomed in. He mentions that road numbers in France can be confusing, and some towns renumber the smaller roads. So you could be following a D24 and it suddenly becomes the D87 and then the D2. So sometimes he recommends that it's easier to navigate by place names rather than by road names. But he recommends the IGN map app as a good way of doing that. Of course, we got the paper map option as well, probably as a backup. I think a lot of the time, as with anywhere, but because I'm talking about touring in a country that's different from my own, I've been lucky that my carrier in the US, which is AT&T, has a very good deal for I think it's over 150 different countries, where basically if I give them an extra $10 a day, which adds up, trust me, I understand, I can use my phone as normal using my existing data plan. So that's pretty helpful for me to use things like Google Maps and all of these other different types of apps where I've got data that works while I'm there. Of course, there's always Wi-Fi if you want to avoid that. And then the more old school way, if you really do want to have some data on you, is you can buy a French SIM card. I had good luck with Orange, which is, I think, the best coverage within all of France. May not necessarily be the best in any given city, but you can be pretty sure that Orange is going to give you the best chance of getting a signal. And of course, it's Orange or Orange. So it's my favorite cell phone carrier in France for a very terrible reason. Just because I like Orange, right? Anyways, I want to really thank Adrian, and I want to thank Kieran as well for writing in. If you have different experiences than what I've talked about, if you've had some bad experiences, or if you have some other things to make sure that people are aware of here in France, it seems like it is an excellent place to do bicycle touring. The camping's great, the food's great, the wine, if you drink it, is great. I think that the routes are amazing. You can begin and end in a major city if you'd like. You've got the ability to leave the country pretty easily if you've got the ability to do that. I'm, of course, assuming that many folks will be able to travel between these countries. Now, of course, with the EU and everything, it makes traveling between EU countries a lot easier, but I did not talk about visas. I don't have to worry about a visa because I've got an American passport. Many of my listeners may not necessarily have that luxury and freedom, so I apologize for not mentioning that earlier. It just occurred to me. So, but since I've been focused on France, I'm just going to focus on, I'm assuming that you can get into France legally and cycle around within France. If you're going to be leaving France, remember there may be some issues with travel outside of the country as well. But I think that overall, I am excited about doing some additional touring in Europe. I think France is certainly going to be one of the countries that I'm looking at. I've looked at Ireland as well. I've looked at the UK. I think that if I were a little bit more adventurous, I would choose France because I think that I've just had such a great time here. It will also force me to brush up on my French a little bit more so I feel more comfortable coming in. Quick reminder that on next week's episode, there will be a full trip prep episode on my Oregon Coast tour. I've got some changes that are coming to that, and I think it'll be really helpful for all of that. The next week is going to be a best of episode. That's going to be a fun one. And then, of course, we'll have some follow-up episodes after that, all about my tour up and down the Oregon coast. And we like to end off the show, as always, with a big thank you to the supporters of the show who are members of the Pedalshift Society. If you like what you hear, you can help maintain Pedalshift as an independent, listener-supported voice while expanding the offerings. We're talking $1, $2, $5 a month. Helps with the cost of hosting the podcast and the website. You can do it for a bit and cancel anytime. One-shot support is welcome as well. If you're not into the small monthly thing, check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Ethan Georgie, Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lane, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Josiah Matthews, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittis, Thomas Skadow, Seth Krieger, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Noah Schroer, Harry Telgadas, John Sikorsky, Richard Killian, Chris Barron, Brian Wren, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Paul Mulvey, Stuart Buchan, Todd Stutz, Mr. T, Roxy Arning, Nathan Poulton, Harry Hugel, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Ruth Divorcey, Michelle Miller, Matthew Lewis, Michael Baker, Billy Crafton, Paul Culbertson, Scott Culbertson, Matt Perry, Danielle Jepson, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Bobby Ruppel, Roy Everett, Greg Braithwaite, John Mayer, William Cairns, Sandy Pizzio, Richard Patch, Mark Messer, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Dave Roll, Joseph Quinn, John Baxter, and Susan Brewster. And thanks also to all past contributors and anonymous contributors for helping make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.